Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Now today I'm back discussing another true crime case, and this one, it can go by a number of different names. Some places call it the Icebox Murders. Some people simply say it's the case of a potential serial killer named Charles Rodgers, while others refer to it as the deaths of Fred and Edwina Rodgers. So there's a lot of little hints there as to what today's video is about. So today's video is technically kind of a serial killer focus, although it is probably more accurate to class it as a suspected serial killer, as it could be relatively conclusively proven, but nothing could come about of it, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I mean by that at the end of the video. Before I get started, I'm just going to include my usual disclaimer just to let you guys know that I'm not claiming by any means to be an expert in this case, nor any of the other videos that I make on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself on the internet, meaning that I may not always get everything right, I may not pronounce everything correctly, I may miss things out, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to do anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply only working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, we shall just get started discussing the case of Fred and Edwina Rodgers' murders and the timeline of Charles Rodgers. Charles Rodgers was born on December the 30th in the year of 1921 in a place called Near Northside in Houston, Texas. There is very little information known regarding his early years, but it is known that when he was 21 years old, so in the year 1942, Charles Rodgers actually enrolled himself in the Texas A&M University, only to very quickly drop out of the course that he decided to study. Instead, he decided to enroll himself in a nuclear physics degree at the University of Houston, where he successfully graduated with his Bachelor of Science degree. Soon after his academic achievements, he enrolled himself as a pilot in the US Navy during World War II, and around the same time he worked in the Office of Naval Intelligence. Following the end of the war, Rodgers secured himself a job at Shell Oil Company working as a seismologist, who is essentially someone that studies and examines earthquake patterns and more generally kind of movements within the Earth centre and how they can have an impact on certain things. Rodgers was noted as being an extremely talented and intelligent individual who was particularly sought after by a number of very huge, large gas and oil conglomerates for his experience and knowledge in their sort of areas and fields. Some sources even claimed that he had the ability to speak a total of 7 languages, amongst having a number of other interests and just a lot of general knowledge in a bunch of other areas and fields. So he was just a very kind of well-educated man, I guess. And then in the year of 1957, Charles Rodgers suddenly quit his job as a seismologist for Shell Oil without any prior indication of doing so, and without giving them any sort of explanation or reasoning behind why he decided to quit. One interesting fact that I came across during my research regarding Charles Rodgers was that he allegedly became acquaintances around this time that he quit his job at Shell Oil with a man named David Ferry, who would later be named as having an involvement in the conspiracy to assassinate JFK. These two supposedly met in the 1950s when they both became members of something called the Civil Air Patrol, which was a form of non-profit membership for people with all backgrounds in aviation fields. All of this constant change in his employment status ended up with him being completely unemployed by the year of 1965, and so it's in this year that he decided it was the best move for him to move back in with his parents. Fred and Edwina Rodgers were an elderly couple aged 81 and 73, happily living in a quiet area in Houston, Texas. The couple were seemingly well liked in the area, and they were allegedly happy to take on their unemployed son, although once he was living in their home, things weren't very normal or easy. Charles would allegedly avoid communicating directly with his parents in any form, but rather informing them of things by sliding notes under their door, which obviously is very strange when you're living in the same house as someone. Fred and Edwina's neighbours also noted his tendency to leave their house for hours upon end before sunrise and then arriving when it had gone into darker hours of the night, and so much so that a lot of the neighbours had been entirely unaware that he'd moved in with the parents for quite a while because he was never seen in daylight hours. The entire situation just wasn't very public, and it was all a bit hush-hush really, as the couple seemed to not really get much of a chance to actually spend time with their son, nor did they know what he was doing on a daily basis when he would disappear for hours on end. Although considering Charles was in his 40s at this point, I suppose this wouldn't really necessarily be a red flag to them because he was an adult and he was supposed to have his own life. And then things took a dark turn in June of 1965 when Edwina's nephew realised that his attempts to ring and just to contact his aunt had been unsuccessful for quite a few days, which was very unusual for her to not get in contact with him. After multiple failed attempts to contact Edwina or Fred, he decided to contact the local police department for fear that something may have happened to the elderly couple and that they weren't able to alert help. And so on June the 23rd of 1963, a pair of police officers arrived at the Rodgers' home, and after receiving no response, they decided to enter the property since there was serious concern for the couple's safety. As they entered the house, they didn't see anything initially that suggested there had been any sort of disorganisation, anything that had been out of place, nor anything that really suggested that they should be concerned for the couple. However, as they were about to leave, one of them clocked the fact that there was plates of food, just like cooked meals, sat untouched on the dining room table. And this struck them as weird. Obviously, there was no sign of anyone in the house, but there was just 2 dinner plates with food on them that hadn't been touched on the table cold, so they decided that they would go back into the kitchen and do a thorough search. So they continued to search the kitchen. They opened all the cupboards, they looked inside the fridge, and inside the fridge there was what they believed to be just large cuts of hog meat stacked unwrapped in the fridge. And as this officer searching the fridge went to close the fridge door, his eye was caught by something in a clear bin typically used to store vegetables, and inside this clear bin was a pair of human heads. And it was at this point that the police officers realised that they had just discovered a fridge full of the dismembered remains of Fred and Edwina Rodgers. The officers immediately reported their discovery, and a team was dispatched to mark off the crime scene and do a thorough investigation into the whole area to see if there was any sign of any of their other remains or who might have done this. They later discovered the majority of the couple's inner organs following a search of a sewer near the house, leading them to believe that the victims were dismembered and then the inner organs had been flushed down the toilet. There were parts of the bodies that were never found, but a large amount was ultimately recovered, enough for a successful autopsy to be carried out. The autopsy determined that the couple had died a few days earlier on Father's Day, June the 20th of 1965, and Fred specifically had died as a result of being hit over the head multiple times with a claw hammer. And the brutality didn't end there, as they later discovered that both his eyes and his genitals had been removed. Edwina Rodgers' cause of death was listed as a result of severe beatings as well as being shot in the head execution style. They were also able to determine that the couple's remains had been dismembered in the upstairs bathroom of their home, and whoever had done so had extreme knowledge on the human body and was able to carry out such a brutal act with extreme precision. There really was not a lot of blood left around the house at all, considering the fact that 2 bodies had been dismembered in the home. There wasn't a lot, leading investigators to believe that whoever had carried out this act had done a thorough job at cleaning up after himself. Whatever blood had been spilt, he cleaned thoroughly. So this kind of suggests that either he had prior experience or just a lot of knowledge in the field. The very minute traces of blood that could be found within the home, found by investigators, had been leading into the direction of Charles Rodgers' bedroom. So they followed the blood essentially and discovered inside his bedroom a saw. It was a saw covered in blood, likely used for the dismemberment of the couple, a blood-stained hammer, and bullet fragments matching the one used to kill Edwina Rodgers. And because of this, law enforcement knew immediately they were to set out on a hunt for Charles Rodgers, the son of the murdered couple, as there had been no sign of him whatsoever in that house. Despite being such a high up and well advertised man of interest, Charles Rodgers was never found, never taken to custody. There was no sign of him, and he remains a missing person of interest to this day, which is absolutely baffling to me. A decade later, in 1975, he was declared as legally dead due to there being absolutely no sign of him for all those years. And technically the murders of Fred and Edwina Rodgers remains unsolved, as Charles Rodgers can be only listed as a high-up person of interest. In more recent years, it has been widely speculated that Charles Rodgers did in fact have some ties to the CIA, some suggesting that he himself was an operative in the CIA and hence why he was able to carry out such a brutal attack and get away with it, while others argue that he just had some strong contacts in the CIA based on contacts that he had made during his job as a seismologist. One person in particular, his name was Hugh Gardenier, has since continued to search into Charles Rodgers' disappearance, using his knowledge as a forensic accountant, as is listed. So he's shared his belief that Rodgers was guilty of murdering his parents and that he'd planned on doing it for a very long time. I'm sorry if you can hear that. There is a bird that has been making a noise throughout this entire video. I'm trying to ignore it, but it's just so loud and abrasive. The main reasoning behind his belief of this had been because Charles Rodgers' father had allegedly been extremely abusive towards him throughout his entire life, and the couple were actually con artists that stole large sums of money from a lot of people, including their son, to get themselves out of gambling and fraud debt, essentially. Hugh Gardenia's theory essentially goes that after the murders, Charles Rodgers fled to Mexico and was able to disappear essentially off the face of the earth thanks to a number of his powerful contacts. And from here, he then moved to Honduras, where he was later killed through a dispute about some sort of pay incident. And this is it's still technically a theory, but this specific part of the theory came from an unknown eyewitness who claimed to have seen Charles in following years in Honduras following his parents' death, as well as a number of anonymous officials and politicians who have allegedly been linked to the case directly. So all of this is technically a theory, but it's kind of a very well-educated, well-researched theory. Hugh Gardenia and his wife Martha actually released a book called The Icebox Murders, which goes into detail about all of the information they collected through their research, as well as much information that they could share in support of their theory, involving a lot of the officials and the politicians. So it's very, very interesting. It's worth a read if you want to hear about all the details, but I haven't gone into too much detail in this sense because it is still technically a theory. If Charles Rodgers had been alive today, he would be nearly 100 years old, and he remains the main and only suspect in the murder of Fred and Edwina Rodgers. So that is the end of this video. This is kind of, hopefully you understand now why it was kind of difficult to decide what to class this information as, because it's obviously the murder of Fred and Edwina Rodgers, but it's also the essentially proven murders of Charles Rodgers, but because he was never found, nothing could ever be technically proven, like he couldn't be prosecuted. It's just fascinating. There are still some people out there that believe that he is actually innocent, that someone framed him, hence why he disappeared off the face of the earth, but there is a lot there to consider, and it's just a very interesting case. So I thought it would be worth me discussing with you guys today. So I hope you guys found this interesting. Let me know your thoughts down below, as well as any of your case requests. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting, and I will see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.